Welcome to Shadows and Crowns, a place where forgotten history drifts through shadows and memory. Tonight, we journey to Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, where one woman began to dance in the streets, and soon hundreds followed in a fevered rhythm that no one could explain. Settle in, let the story move slowly, and allow sleep to find you as we begin the tale of the dancing plague. The summer of 1518 had come heavy and close upon the city of Strasbourg. July lay over the rooftops like a blanket, thick with heat and the stillness of long afternoons. The cobbled alleys warmed early each morning, stones storing the sun's weight until late into the night. Wooden shutters leaned half-closed over narrow windows, yet through every crack drifted the hum of flies, the smell of bread from ovens, and the faint, sharp tang of horse manure that baked quickly in the streets. It was on such a morning that Frau Troffea stepped from her house into the alley. Her shoes met the cobbles with a sound as plain as any other footstep. Neighbors glanced briefly, expecting nothing unusual. She was a woman, known but not remarkable. One more thread in the woven life of the city. Yet on this morning, she began to move differently. She placed one foot forward, then another, and then instead of pausing, she did not stop. Her steps gathered a rhythm, a slow, swaying cadence. At first, it might have seemed the absent-minded pacing of someone caught in thought. Yet soon, her feet no longer obeyed the small hesitations of ordinary walking. They pressed onward, heel and toe against the stones, marking time as if some distant music guided them. The morning was still young, the shadows short and sharp against the walls. A baker's boy carrying a tray of loaves slowed to stare. Frau Troffea's arms moved with her body now, rising slightly, falling again, as though she followed unheard strings of sound. The cobblestones beneath her grew warm beneath the constant press of her shoes. Their edges were uneven, some slick from the night's thin dew, some rough and catching against the leather. Yet she danced on. By noon, the air was heavy. A pale haze gathered above the rooftops. Neighbors leaned from windows, puzzled. Frau Troffea's husband came to the door, calling her name, his voice uncertain, neither angry nor alarmed, but drawn with the confusion of one who cannot find the line between sense and strangeness. She did not answer. Her feet tapped and turned, her skirt swayed, dust clung to the hem. She seemed neither joyful nor distressed, only compelled, her face calm, her eyes unfixed. The market day wore on. Chickens fussed in their cages, their feathers sticking to the sweat of handlers' arms. Cheese softened in the heat. The smell of onions, ripe fruit, and singed fat drifted on the air. Amidst it all, Frau Troffea continued her strange occupation. The rhythm of her steps joined the other sounds of the street. The clop of hooves, the creak of carts, the murmur of bargaining voices. Children gathered first, drawn by curiosity. They whispered and pointed, their laughter kept low, for even they sensed something unusual in the steadiness of her movement. Then adults joined, shaking their heads. Some muttered prayers, others speculated. Was she struck by fever or mocking some unknown festival? But whatever thoughts they voiced, none could deny that the hours passed and she did not rest. The sun sank westward, shadows stretching long and cool across the stones. Frau Troffea danced still. Her husband brought water, holding it out with pleading eyes. She paused long enough to sip, her lips touching the rim, and then her feet carried her onward, unbroken, unyielding. Night came. The air cooled at last. Lamps glowed faintly from doorways, their light spilling over the cobbles. Frau Trophea's outline moved steadily through the dimness, a figure caught between shadow and glow. By then, many had drifted home, but still a few lingered, compelled to watch. They saw the persistence of her body, the refusal of her legs to cease their motion. Some crossed themselves before retiring, unsettled by the sight. Others muttered that perhaps she was seized by God or by some darker force. And when dawn broke again, they found her still there. The second day began with the smell of fresh dough, the chatter of early vendors, the cry of gulls straying inland along the river. Frau Trophea's dance had slowed, her steps less forceful now, but no less constant. Dust rose in tiny puffs beneath her soles. The skin of her hands glistened, and the cloth of her dress clung damp to her body. Still she moved. The cobbles seemed to press into her, molding her path, guiding her steps. Her shoes, worn now, scuffed and thinned, echoed against the stones with a softened beat. Some who watched swore they heard music, faint, elusive, impossible to name, though no instrument played. On the third day, whispers passed quickly through the city. Traders carried the tale into every corner, a woman who could not stop her dancing. People came from beyond the neighborhood to see her, crowding the alley's edges. They brought questions, remedies, even laughter, though the laughter often faltered as they stood longer, watching. There was a gravity to her persistence, a weight that silenced easy jest. The heat pressed down again, relentless. The stones seemed to shimmer in the sun. She moved through it with eyes half closed, as if guarding some secret rhythm known only to her. By evening, musicians were brought, urged to play. Perhaps some thought if sound filled the air, she might find resolution. Pipes and drums began their measures, and the air shook with their notes. Did her body follow them? Some swore it did. Others said she paid them no mind at all, that she danced only to whatever voice had already claimed her. The neighbors grew weary, but she did not. Sleep passed over the city like a tide, yet she remained on her feet, moving endlessly, as if sleep itself had forgotten her. The fourth day rose clear, the bells of the cathedral ringing out across rooftops. Still, in the heat and dust, Frau Trophea moved. Her face had grown pale, her lips cracked, but her steps continued. The crowd around her had swelled, for word of her strange endurance spread quickly. Some stood in awe, some in fear. A few tried to approach, to take her by the arms, but she shook them off gently, almost without awareness, her body unwilling to break from its rhythm. Her persistence had become something larger than herself now, a spectacle woven into the fabric of the city's days. Stone beneath her feet, heat pressing down, murmurs rising all around. And through it all, the dance. Hours blurred into one another, until day and night were almost indistinguishable to those who watched. The cobbles seemed to hold her memory, each step leaving an imprint, not of weight, but of motion itself, a pattern that lingered after her body passed. The air grew thick with expectation. Was this an illness, a curse, a vision sent from heaven? Or was it something more ordinary, yet no less bewildering, a body set loose from will, compelled by its own hidden currents? None could say. Frau Trophea did not explain. She simply moved, hour after hour, as Strasbourg leaned close to watch, listen, and wonder. Her figure, swaying against the walls of stone, marked the beginning of something greater, though none could yet name it. The rhythm she carried alone would soon spread, touching others, drawing them into the same unrelenting motion. But for now, she remained solitary, one woman in the July heat, her shoes striking the cobbles in ceaseless measure. The city breathed around her, bread baking, water drawn, bells calling, animals restless, merchants calling their wares. Life continued in its ordinary forms. And within it, at the heart of the alley, a single figure danced on, unbroken, unending, her steps carrying the quiet strangeness of beginnings. And so the days passed, steady as her motion, each hour folding softly into the next. The dance neither joyous nor sorrowful, but persistent, like the turning of the seasons, like the slow drift of the river beyond the city's walls. In the stillness of night, when the city settled into slumber, the sound of her steps could still be heard, tapping gently against the stones. A rhythm without music, a mystery unfolding at its own patient pace. The city of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 lay within walls of stone and timber, a place both bustling and anxious, alive with trade yet weighted with worry. Its streets wound in narrow threads, cobbled paths converging at squares where markets filled the air with cries and smells. The cathedral towered over it all, a mountain of carved sandstone rising above roofs and chimneys, its bells marking the rhythm of each day, steady as a heartbeat that the whole city shared. At dawn, the bells rang first, their notes rolling across the rooftops. The sound traveled through mist that lingered above the River Ill, where barges waited to carry grain, wine, and cloth along the waters. The fishermen heard it, pulling nets heavy with river carp. The bakers heard it, drawing bread from their ovens, scent rising through the alleys. The guildsmen heard it too, smiths, butchers, tailors, coopers, each bound to their craft, sworn to rules that governed their work as strictly as the bells governed their hours. Life in Strasbourg was crowded, full of voices and labor. The markets swelled with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Women carried baskets brimming with onions and herbs. Merchants unrolled cloth dyed in deep blues and reds. Barrels of beer were lifted and rolled, their rims clattering against the stones. The air carried many smells at once: sharp vinegar, spiced sausages, fresh hay, smoke from chimneys not yet gone cold despite the summer's heat. Yet beneath this busyness, unease lingered. Harvests had faltered in recent years. Grain was scarce, prices high. Many households stretched their bread thin, filling bellies with broth and roots when flour ran short. Famine had brushed the city, leaving memories that clung to those who had gone hungry. Disease, too, had passed through in waves, sickness of the gut, fevers that carried neighbors away within days. In the churchyards, crosses had multiplied. The sermons from Strasbourg's pulpit spoke often of sin, of divine judgment, of wrath waiting to fall upon a people grown careless. Priests warned of pride, greed, and lust, of the devil prowling at the edges of daily life. The citizens listened, some with bowed heads, some with restless fear, others with weary resignation. Every misfortune seemed to confirm the warnings, the failed crops, the illnesses, the accidents along the river. And in July, the air itself seemed heavy with foreboding, as though the city stood on the edge of something it could not yet see. Among these warnings was one tale repeated often in hushed tones: the curse of Saint Vitus, the saint remembered for his suffering. was said to punish sinners by condemning them to dance without rest, their bodies no longer their own. It was a story told for generations, a caution carried across villages and cities alike. Children grew up hearing of men and women seized by sudden motion, whirling and stamping until their strength gave out. Some said it was divine punishment, others that it was possession, still others that it was a fever of the blood. Whatever its truth, the image was strong, a body forced to move endlessly, caught in a rhythm that could not be broken. So when Frau Trophea began her solitary dance in the heat of July, those who saw her could not help but think of Saint Vitus. The story was too near, too familiar. It hummed beneath their thoughts as they watched her feet strike the cobbles. The curse of the saint was no longer a tale told in sermons. It was living in their streets. Yet life in Strasbourg pressed on as it always did. The guilds met in their halls, candles burning over long tables, where rules were read aloud and disputes settled. Apprentices swept shavings from the floors of workshops, learning the weight of tools and the patience of craft. Housewives drew water from the fountains, gossiping as they waited their turn. Children ran through the lanes, their laughter rising briefly above the noise of traders and carts. The city was full of sound. Bells from the cathedral rang not only the hours, but also feast days and processions, filling the air with solemn music. Drums sometimes echoed in the square, marking festivals or mustering guards. On Sundays, the sermon stretched long, words falling like slow rain over the congregation. The river, too, was a presence. It curved around the city, its branches enclosing Strasbourg in a watery embrace. Barges loaded with sacks of grain or wheels of cheese drifted downstream, their sails catching the faintest winds. Children leaned from the banks to watch, while washerwomen slapped clothes against stones, their arms strong, their songs carrying across the water. The smell of wet reeds and river mud mingled with that of tar and pitch, used to seal the boats. The city lived by these rhythms: bells, markets, sermons, the movement of the river. Yet even as life appeared steady, beneath it lay tension. The memory of famine pressed against the present. The warnings of priests echoed in ears already tuned to fear. And as whispers of Frau Trophea's ceaseless dancing spread, they seemed to join all these threads together, a sign that the unease of years past had taken sudden, visible form. Some said the city had angered heaven. Others blamed the sins of neighbors. Still others quietly thought of hunger and disease and the strain of daily toil, believing that perhaps the body itself, pushed too far, might break into strange patterns, like a wheel spinning when its axle loosens. Yet such thoughts were spoken softly, if at all. For most, the story of Saint Vitus was explanation enough, and terrifying in its clarity. As dusk fell over Strasbourg, torches flared in the squares, their smoke rising in slow spirals. Shadows stretched across the cobbles. From the cathedral, the bells tolled again, their sound rolling over roof and river alike. People returned to their homes, shutters drawn, doors barred, candles lit against the gathering dark. In those hours, as sleep crept through the city, the thought of Frau Troffea's dancing pressed quietly at the edge of dreams. The streets grew still, the noise of the day fading. Only the sound of the river remained, moving patiently around the city walls. Yet in the heart of Strasbourg, beneath the quiet of night, the dance continued, an echo of story and fear, a rhythm that seemed both ancient and new, as if the city itself had been drawn into motion. Strasbourg slept uneasily, cradled by its bells, its markets, its river, and its sermons, yet haunted by the knowledge that in its own streets one woman danced on, and that the curse of Saint Vitus was no longer a tale of other times, but a shadow that had stepped into their own. And so the city waited as July pressed onward, hot and heavy, each day a mirror of the last. The guilds labored, the sermons thundered, the bells rang, the river flowed, and in the quiet margins fear pooled like water in a low place. The air seemed to carry it, a heaviness that touched every market cry, every church prayer, every tolling note of the cathedral's great bell. The city, rich in trade, proud in its walls, alive with sound and scent, now held within it a secret rhythm, one that had begun in a single pair of feet and threatened to spread, quiet as rumor, strong as faith, unstoppable as the river's own current. The dance that began with one woman did not stay solitary for long. In the first days, Frau Troffea's movements seemed only a curiosity, something to remark upon while hurrying to the market or while pausing by the well. Yet word traveled swiftly through Strasbourg's narrow lanes, carried from mouth to mouth, passed from neighbor to neighbor. By the week's end, her ceaseless motion had become a matter the whole city knew. And then something stranger still occurred. Others began to join her. No one could say precisely when it happened, for the days blurred together, heat pressing down, bells marking the hours as they always did. Yet by the seventh morning, more bodies were moving beside her in the square. At first, a handful, men and women whose faces were drawn with the same curious calm, whose feet struck the stones with the same tireless rhythm. They did not speak, nor seem to notice one another. Their movements were not coordinated, yet together they filled the square with a restless energy, like wind stirring a field of tall grass. Onlookers gathered at every corner. Some gasped, some crossed themselves, some whispered of Saint Vitus's curse. Children were hushed, pulled close by mothers' arms. The dancers themselves did not stop to eat or rest. They moved until sweat soaked their clothes, until their legs shook, yet still they did not falter. By midday, the square rang with sound. The scuff of shoes against stone, the steady slap of soles, the shuffle and stamp of dozens of bodies in motion. Dust rose into the air, catching the light of the sun, turning the square hazy. The smell of sweat mingled with that of horses and the day's cooking fires. The city council could not ignore it. Strasbourg's leaders gathered in chambers cooled by thick walls of stone, consulting with clerics and physicians. The question was asked in solemn tones. What afflicted the city? Was it sin? Was it poison? Was it madness? The physicians spoke first. They dismissed possession, setting aside the talk of curses and demons. This, they said, was an illness of the body, a sickness of the blood. The heat and the years of poor harvest had unsettled humors, inflamed the heart, and set bodies into motion beyond their own will. Resisting it, they warned, would only worsen the condition. Better to allow the dancers to continue, to give them space and air, even encouragement, until the fever burned itself away. The council listened, and in their uncertainty, they accepted the advice. So it was that the city, instead of halting the dance, prepared to widen it. Musicians were summoned, fiddlers, drummers, pipers. They were ordered to play in the square to accompany the dancers, to ease their suffering by carrying them deeper into the rhythm that already possessed them. Guild halls were cleared of their benches and tables, offered as spaces for the afflicted to move freely, away from the narrow alleys. Soon the air of Strasbourg was filled not only with the stamping of feet, but with music. Fiddles sang sharp, bright notes that spun into the heat. Drums thudded steady as heartbeats. Flutes and pipes threaded high above, their tunes winding like thin smoke. Together they created a sound that seemed to bind the dancers even more tightly to their steps. Crowds gathered in greater numbers now, filling windows and streets, pressing into every available space to watch. The square swelled with bodies, some moving, some still, yet all caught in the strange spectacle. The musicians played on, sweat darkening their collars, arms aching with the unbroken effort. The dancers numbered not dozens, but scores, then hundreds. Men, women, yea, young and old. Some strangers, some neighbors, all swept into the motion, unable to stop. They swayed, they leapt, they turned, their shoes wearing thin against the stones. Some collapsed, bodies crumpling to the ground, only to rise again if strength returned. Others lay still, carried away by neighbors, while the dance pressed onward without pause. The sound of it filled the city. From the riverbank, one could hear the faint echo of fiddles and drums. From the steps of the cathedral, the rhythm of feet seemed to mingle with the bells themselves. From distant alleys where merchants still sold bread and cheese, the whispers of onlookers carried. The dancer, the cursed, the afflicted, the chosen. Awe and dread mixed in equal measure. Some looked upon the dancers as holy, seized by visions beyond mortal understanding. Others saw only punishment, a mirror of the city's sins made visible in bodies undone. Still others shook their heads, weary, bewildered, speaking of sickness and heat, of humors out of balance. The city pulsed with the strange life of it. Days and nights blurred together. Torches lit the square after sunset, their flames flickering over faces drawn and pale, over limbs that trembled yet still moved. The music did not stop. Instruments were passed between weary players so the sound might continue unbroken. In the guild halls, benches scraped aside, the dancers were led indoors when the streets grew too crowded. Their feet struck wooden floors now, the boards groaning beneath the constant rhythm. Lantern light swayed against the walls. The air grew close, hot with breath and motion, thick with the smell of sweat and wax. Outside citizens whispered of numbers, 50, 100 more each day. The city had never seen such a sight. Markets faltered, for many came not to trade but to watch. Sermons thundered of sin and penance, yet their words seemed to fade against the ceaseless sound of music and feet. The river flowed past, steady and indifferent, carrying barges of grain, while within the walls Strasbourg spun in its own bewildering dance. And through it all, Frau Trophea was remembered. For it was she who began the motion, she whose solitary steps in the heat of July had grown into a tide that the city could not contain. Some said she still moved among them, indistinguishable now in the sea of bodies, yet present, the spark that had lit the fire. Day after day, night after night, the dance spread. Shoes wore through, feet bled against stone. Yet the rhythm did not cease. The fiddles played, the drums beat, the guild halls echoed. The square throbbed with sound and motion. Strasbourg itself seemed caught in a fever dream, every corner touched by the pulse of bodies compelled to move. And so the city swayed between awe and dread, wonder and fear, as the music rose and fell, as the dancers turned endlessly in their measure. It was as if time itself had bent to the rhythm, slow and steady, unbroken, carrying Strasbourg deeper into a mystery it could not name. The bells tolled the hours, yet the dance paid them no heed. The river flowed on, yet its current seemed slower than the ceaseless motion of the square. And above it all, the cathedral towered, its spire pointing heavenward, silent witness to a city overcome by its own strange rhythm. In those weeks of July, Strasbourg became not merely a place of trade and sermons, but a stage upon which something unearthly unfolded. Hundreds of bodies moving together, compelled yet unwilling, graceful yet exhausted, a vision that was both beautiful and terrible, dreamlike and real. And in the quiet moments between the notes of fiddles and the thrum of drums, when torches flickered low and the dancers' shadows stretched long upon the stones, the city seemed to hold its breath, as though listening for an answer that never came. The weeks wore on, and the dance in Strasbourg grew too heavy to be endured. What had begun as one woman's restless motion had swelled into hundreds, filling the square, overflowing into guild halls, echoing through the nights with fiddles and drums. Yet the music that had been meant as cure did not heal. Instead, the numbers grew, and with them the city's unease. Men collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies carried away from the press of feet. Women fainted, rising only to resume the steps that consumed them. Some never rose at all. And still, more joined each day, drawn into the strange rhythm, as if it were a tide that no one could resist. The council who had once ordered the musicians to play now gathered again in heavy silence. Their earlier confidence had melted into unease. Physicians' remedies had not eased the plague. Priests' sermons had not ended it. And so, at last, the council turned to older traditions, to stories that had drifted down through the years like worn prayer beads passed from hand to hand. The curse of Saint Vitus. It had been whispered from the beginning. Now it was spoken aloud. If the afflicted were truly caught in his grip, then only the saint himself might loosen it. And so the council resolved. The dancers must be led away, carried to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the town of Saverne, a day's journey to the west where prayers might be said and the curse lifted. The decision spread quietly throughout Strasbourg, moving in hushed voices along the alleys. The stages erected for music were torn down. The fiddlers and drummers were dismissed. Where once there had been noisy spectacle, now there was silence, broken only by the scuff of weary feet. Arrangements were made for the afflicted. The worst of them, those whose bodies trembled and swayed without ceasing, were chosen first. They were dressed in special garments for the pilgrimage. Shoemakers prepared red shoes, bright as blood, their soles marked with small black crosses painted carefully by priestly hands. The color was meant to honor the saint, the crosses to ward off further torment. When the day came, incense drifted through the square as the chosen were gathered. The smoke curled upward, softening the air with the fragrance of resin and spice. Priests moved among the dancers, sprinkling holy water that glittered briefly in the sun before vanishing on stone and skin alike. Words of prayer rose and fell, intoned steadily, not as command, but as lull. Their rhythm meant to steady the faltering bodies before them. One by one, the afflicted were guided to carts and wagons. Some stumbled, their feet still seeking the rhythm of the dance. Others were carried, their limbs slack with exhaustion. Neighbors watched in silence, crossing themselves as the procession took shape. Horses stamped their hooves against the cobbles, waiting. And then, slowly, the wagons rolled westward, leaving Strasbourg behind. The road to Saverne stretched long and dusty under the summer sun. Fields lay golden with ripening grain, though patchy in places, reminders of lean harvests past. The air smelled of hay and warm earth. Grasshoppers sprang from the roadside, vanishing into weeds. The wheels of the wagons creaked in steady rhythm, joined by the muffled sound of feet dragging within, bodies still swaying even in transit. Villagers along the way paused to watch. They saw the wagons pass, marked by red shoes, crosses painted upon soles, incense pots swinging gently as priests walked alongside. Some villagers murmured prayers, others whispered to one another, pointing at the afflicted who rocked and shuddered in their seats. Few raised their voices, for the procession carried a weight that demanded silence. The day grew long, and heat shimmered above the road. Dust clung to skin, settling into hair, staining the hems of robes. Water was given at intervals, cups passed carefully into trembling hands. Some of the afflicted drank without pause, lips cracked and dry. Others spilled the water in their restless movement, their hands unable to hold still. Yet the journey continued, hour by hour, the wagons rolling slowly through the countryside. The rhythm of hooves against dirt became a kind of music of its own, soft and unhurried, carrying the procession toward its destination. By evening, the spire of Saverne's church came into view, rising faintly above the clustered roofs of the town. Relief stirred in the priests' voices as they urged the horses onward, incense still curling upward from its pots, prayers still murmured without cease. The shrine of St. Vitus lay just beyond, a place long visited by those who feared his curse. Its stones were cool even in the summer heat, its air scented with wax from countless candles burned in petition. Statues of saints lined its walls, their eyes carved in calm, their hands lifted in blessing. At the center stood the image of Vitus himself, youthful and serene, one hand raised in benediction, the other holding the palm of martyrdom. The afflicted were led inside. Their red shoes struck the flagstones softly, the black crosses on their soles visible with each step. The air within was dim, lit by flickering candles that cast wavering shadows against the walls. The scent of incense thickened, mingling with that of beeswax and stone. Priests began the rituals. Crosses were traced over foreheads. Holy water was sprinkled upon the red shoes, droplets shining briefly before sinking into leather. Prayers were spoken slowly, each syllable measured, voices overlapping in low murmur. Hymns rose in unison, not loud but steady, their cadence echoing faintly in the high vaults of the shrine. The afflicted swayed before the altar. Some fell to their knees, not in supplication, but because their legs gave way beneath them. Others lay upon the stones, their arms trembling, their bodies unable to cease their motion even as they collapsed. Yet the prayers did not falter. The candles burned. The air thickened with incense until it seemed the shrine itself was suspended in smoke and shadow. Time passed in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of voices, the soft shuffle of restless feet, the crackle of wicks as candle flames leaned and straightened. Outside, night settled over Severn. Stars emerged in the sky above, bright against the dark, distant and steady as the prayers within. The shrine held its vigil. Dancers, priests, onlookers, all were folded into the same stillness, the same atmosphere of hushed awe. Whatever afflicted Strasbourg, whatever mystery had driven its citizens into ceaseless motion, now rested within the keeping of the saint. The city had done what it could. The rest was left to powers beyond its reach. And so the afflicted lay in their red shoes, crosses painted upon their soles, the scent of incense heavy about them, as voices of prayer drifted into the night. Strasbourg waited behind them, its markets hushed, its squares strangely still without the sound of fiddles or the endless stamp of feet. The road between city and shrine was empty once more, dust settling slowly back into silence. The dancing plague had not yet ended, but in that quiet night at Severn, beneath the flicker of candles and the steady presence of Saint Vitus, the afflicted were held in ritual, as though wrapped in a lull that belonged not to cure or explanation, but to faith itself. The dancing that gripped Strasbourg in that heavy summer did not leave its sufferers untouched. However strange, however inexplicable the compulsion, the human body could not endure such ceaseless motion without cost. And so, day after day, the toll became visible upon the dancers themselves, written in the language of flesh and fatigue. Feet bore the first marks. The cobbles of the square were hard, uneven, their stones warmed by sun and roughened by time, Against them, shoes wore thin, leather scuffed until seams split and soles peeled away. When the coverings gave out, skin met stone directly, swelling, blistering, breaking. Red spread across heels and toes, streaks left with every step. Some bound their feet in rags when cloth could be found, but the fabric soon darkened, soaked with sweat, and sometimes with blood. Still, the rhythm went on. Eyes told another story. At first wide, startled, darting like those of people unsure of what held them. Then as hours became days, the gaze turned inward, glassy, unfocused. Eyelids heavy, lashes clumped with salt from constant sweat. Some seemed not to see the crowds at all, only some vision within, carried along by music no one else could hear. Clothes clung damp to skin, soaked through in the July heat. Garments, once neat, now hung in disarray. Hems streaked with dust, bodices stained dark. The smell of sweat was constant, mingling with the sourness of exertion and the faint iron tang of blood. Yet even as garments grew heavier with moisture, dancers did not pause to change or rest. Their bodies moved of their own accord, heedless of discomfort. Exhaustion drew itself in every line of the dancers' forms. Shoulders sagged, spines bent forward. Limbs shook with tremors that never fully ceased, even in brief stillness. Muscles swelled and cramped, calves knotting with pain, thighs quivering from the strain of endless steps. Some moved with jerks and stumbles, legs dragging briefly before finding rhythm again. Others spun still with surprising grace, though each turn cost them dearly. Collapse was frequent. A dancer would falter, knees buckling, body falling suddenly to the ground. For a moment, silence would ripple through those watching, the noise of feet broken by the thud of a body on stone. Neighbors would rush forward, lifting the fallen into shade, bringing water, wiping brows with cloths. Some rose again, pushed upward by the same strange compulsion, returning to the dance with steps slower but still unceasing. Others could not rise, their limbs shaking without strength. There were whispers of death. Some claimed men and women danced until life itself gave out, their bodies still only when breath was gone. The chronicles of the time recorded such tales, though the numbers remain uncertain, shrouded in rumor. Did dozens perish, or fewer? The truth has blurred in the centuries since. Yet whether many or few, the suffering of those who fell cannot be denied. Each collapse bore the weight of fragility. Each faltering step revealed the limits of flesh. And still, in the midst of it all, there was endurance. However strained, however pain, bodies kept moving long past what seemed possible. Hearts beat fast but steady. Lungs heaved with ragged breath, yet filled again and again. The persistence itself was astonishing, as though beneath the affliction, there lay a reserve of strength unguessed at until tested. Compassion grew among the onlookers. At first, there had been curiosity, even laughter in corners. But as the days lengthened, those who watched saw only human fragility mirrored back to them. Mothers pressed their children close, whispering prayers for protection. Neighbors fetched water and bread, though many offerings were left untouched. Men stood silently at the edges of the square, their faces grim, their eyes lingering not on spectacle but on suffering. The priests prayed. Incense drifted through the heat, its smoke curling above the bent heads of the dancers. Holy water was sprinkled upon them, cool droplets striking hot skin. Yet the motion did not cease. Physicians rubbed ointments into swollen legs, pressed poultices to bruised feet, counseled rest that the dancers could not grant themselves. Through it all, the square pulsed with the rhythm that seemed both ancient and relentless. The sound of soles on stone became a heartbeat larger than any individual. The city itself seemed caught in sympathy, every building leaning toward the square, every bell tolling in counterpoint. Night brought no reprieve. Torches were lit, their flames flickering against faces drawn and pale. The dancers' shadows lengthened across the cobbles, stretched thin by the glow. Sweat cooled briefly in the night air, then warmed again as bodies kept their pace. Collapses came more frequently in those hours, exhaustion heavier in the dark. Yet still, many moved on, their persistence carrying them until dawn returned. By morning, the square was streaked with traces of the night's exertion. Rags discarded, shoes abandoned, stains dark upon the stones. Yet as the sun rose higher, the rhythm resumed. The afflicted once more bound to their motion. The toll was not only physical, but also quiet, inward. There was the weariness of minds stretched thin, of spirits tested. Some dancers wept as they moved, tears running unchecked across sweat-streaked cheeks. Others murmured prayers, words half lost in the rhythm of breath. Some showed no expression at all, their faces calm, serene as though the body had parted from the self, leaving only motion behind. And in this, perhaps, there was something more than suffering, something fragile but undeniable. Endurance, not born of choice, but of a body's stubborn will to continue. Each step, though painful, carried a kind of defiance against collapse. Each breath, though ragged, marked another moment of survival. Reports speak of death, yet also of recovery. Some dancers, after days or weeks, simply ceased, their bodies at last returning to stillness. They rested, they healed. They bore the scars of blisters and bruises, but they lived. The memory of their ordeal lingered, shaping their lives, shaping their city. The exact number of those lost, equals, uncertain, blurred in the haze of time. But what remains clear is the endurance shown in the face of compulsion, the strange persistence of fragile bodies bound to a rhythm they could not refuse. The dancing plague remains a mystery, its cause unknown. Yet, in the streets of Strasbourg that summer, what was most visible was neither miracle nor curse, but human frailty. Feet swollen and torn, eyes glazed with fatigue, garments drenched with sweat. And alongside it, human endurance, the body's capacity to continue even when the mind had surrendered. The city watched, helpless yet compassionate, bearing witness to the strange blend of suffering and resilience. And in that bearing witness, Strasbourg too became marked. Its people carrying forward the memory of bodies that could not rest, of neighbors who moved beyond their own strength, of fragility that endured longer than any thought possible. As the days passed, the square grew quieter. One by one, the dancers stilled, either through collapse, through ritual at the shrine, or through some mysterious lessening of the fever. Shoes lay abandoned where they had fallen, red leather or torn cloth left scattered upon the stones. The city drew breath again, its markets resuming, its bells tolling once more for ordinary hours rather than strange spectacles. But the memory lingered, like a faint echo of music no longer played. And in that memory, Strasbourg carried the lesson of fragility, of endurance, of the strange dance between suffering and survival. When the dancers of Strasbourg at last grew still, the city was left with silence and questions. The square, once filled with the restless stamp of feet, held only memory. And into that stillness poured attempts to explain what had happened. Voices from physicians, priests, and later scholars of centuries to come. In the 16th century, medicine was governed by humors, the belief that the body's balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile determined health. Physicians in Strasbourg turned to this framework readily. They spoke of overheated blood, of humor stirred into frenzy by the summer's oppressive heat. They advised motion rather than restraint, arguing that the fever must burn itself out, that the body must exhaust its excess until balance was restored. This belief led them to summon fiddlers and drummers to encourage the very thing that tormented their patients. Paracelsus, the wandering physician and philosopher of the age, wrote of the Strasbourg plague years later. In his interpretation, the dancers were not merely ill, but overtaken by a kind of passion. He spoke of women seized by unfulfilled desires, of emotions boiling over into the body. His words carried the blend of medicine and moral judgment common to his time, an effort to explain the unexplainable through the tools of both science and story. Centuries later, other theories emerged. Among them was ergot poisoning, the idea that rye infected with a fungus had filled bread with toxins, producing convulsions and hallucinations. It was a neat possibility, for ergot is real, and its effects are powerful. Yet the theory falters in the details. Ergot poisoning cripples rather than sustains. Its victims do not dance for days, but writhe with pain, their limbs twisted by spasms, their circulation cut off until fingers and toes blacken. The Strasbourg dancers moved too long, too fluidly for such a cause. The explanation, once tempting, falls away under the weight of the evidence. What remains is stranger, but also more human. The idea of mass psychogenic illness, what earlier centuries might have called hysteria, and what today we might describe as the mind's burden overflowing into the body. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city pressed by hunger, by the memory of plague, by sermons of sin and divine wrath. The belief in St. Vitus's curse was already alive in the minds of its citizens. In such a climate, it is not difficult to imagine one woman's strange compulsion sparking recognition in others, their bodies caught by the same fear, the same expectation. The dance, spread not by contagion of the flesh, but by contagion of the mind. Belief made manifest in motion. It was not the first time such an outbreak occurred. In 1374, more than a century earlier, the Rhine Valley saw its own plague of dancers moving in the streets of Aachen and Cologne, their numbers swelling, their bodies collapsing from exhaustion. And long after Strasbourg, echoes of similar phenomena appeared. In 1962, in Tanganyika, schoolgirls began to laugh. At first a few, then dozens, then hundreds, unable to stop. Their mirth spilling over into neighboring villages until thousands were caught in the contagion of laughter. No toxin, no demon, no saint's curse was needed. Only the strange strength of human belief and the fragility of human nerves under strain. The dancing plague of Strasbourg may never be explained with final certainty. Its details blur in the chronicles. Its numbers remain uncertain. Its causes elusive. Yet in reflection, what stands out is less the puzzle than the pattern. Human beings bound together in times of stress, bodies speaking the language of fear and faith when words prove insufficient. The square is long quiet now. The guild halls have been rebuilt. The markets long changed. The river still flowing past as it did in 1518. Yet in the memory of Strasbourg and in the stories carried forward, the dancers remain, figures swaying in the July heat, caught between suffering and endurance, mystery and meaning. Their steps echo faintly still, not as spectacle, but as reminder that the mind and body are never fully apart, that belief has power, and that fragility itself can shape history. By the turning of August into September, the fever of movement in Strasbourg began at last to ebb. The square, once alive with stamping feet and restless music, grew quieter with each passing day. One by one, the dancers stilled. Some found rest after being carried to the shrine at Saverne. Others faltered and lay exhausted in the guild halls. And many simply slowed, their bodies at last too weary to continue. The bans on music, once proclaimed in urgent tones, remained in place, but the fiddles and drums had already fallen silent. No more stages were built. No more guild halls cleared for dancing. Where once torches had burned through the night, illuminating shadows that leapt and swayed against the stone, now only the ordinary lamps of doorways glowed soft and steady. The city was slowly returning to itself. Families stepped forward into the quiet. Sons and daughters guided fathers home, supporting arms trembling from days of exertion. Mothers drew shawls around their children, walking them slowly from the square where they had swayed for so long. Neighbors opened their doors to those too weak to walk, laying them down on straw beds, bathing their swollen feet, pressing cups of water to cracked lips. The rhythm that had bound so many was loosening at last, its grip fading into memory. By early September, the markets reopened with their full voices. Merchants cried their wares once more. Onions and apples laid in baskets. Wheels of cheese rolled out onto wooden planks. The air smelled of roasting meat, of fresh bread drawn from ovens. Children's laughter returned to the streets, mingling with the calls of hawkers. It was the sound of a city rediscovering its ordinary life. The cathedral bells resumed their steady command of hours and days. Their tolling no longer seemed to answer the ceaseless stamping of feet, but to mark the passage of time as it always had. Morning mass, midday trade, evening rest. Their sound carried calmly across rooftops and river, as if reclaiming the air from the fevered music that had filled it for so many weeks. In sermons, priests spoke of the summer just past. Some named it a warning of sin, others a trial permitted by God to test the faithful. The congregations listened in weary silence, many still tending to blisters, many still troubled by dreams of endless motion. Yet even in the solemn words, there was relief. The crisis was waning, life was resuming. The square once more belonged to ordinary footsteps. Frau Trophea, who had first stepped into the July heat and begun to move, disappeared from the record. Her name, once repeated in whispers across the city, fades into silence. Whether she recovered, whether she was healed at Saverne, whether she was lost to exhaustion, no one can say. She remains only as the spark remembered at the beginning, her fates swallowed by the shadows of history. The air of Strasbourg, heavy for so long, seemed lighter as autumn neared. Cool winds drifted in from the river, carrying the scent of damp reeds and fallen leaves. The cobblestones, once pounded by countless shoes, lay still beneath the quiet tread of ordinary life. Dust settled. Silence deepened. The city, after weeks of strange motion, seemed to exhale at last. What lingered was memory. Neighbors spoke of the faces they had seen in trance, of the sound of hundreds of feet striking stone, of the exhaustion written in swollen limbs and glassy eyes. Yet the memory softened quickly, wrapped in the rhythm of daily life. Guilds meeting in their halls, barges drifting past on the river, bells ringing from the cathedral tower. Strasbourg endured. The markets filled again, the sermons continued, the river flowed, and the dancers, once at the heart of the city's life, receded into silence, their steps fading into history. The summer of 1518 passed into autumn, leaving behind not only stories of strangeness, but also a quiet relief, a city breathing again after weeks of compulsion. In the hush of September nights, with stars scattered above the rooftops and the cathedral bell tolling softly, Strasbourg lay still, its long fever of motion at last ended. The dancing plague of 1518 is remembered not only as an oddity of history, but as a mirror held up to the human condition. Its meaning has been searched for in sermons, in chronicles, in the writings of physicians and philosophers, and later in the scholarship of centuries. Yet even where explanations falter, the event itself speaks gently of the ties between belief, fear, community, and the fragile strength of the human body. The people of Strasbourg lived in a world thick with meaning. Signs of divine favor or wrath were sought in the harvest, in the health of neighbors, in the tolling of bells. Fear was not only of famine or disease, but of sin, of curses, of forces beyond sight. When Frau Trophea's feet struck the cobbles, she stepped not only into the street, but into a web of expectations woven long before her. To the eyes of her neighbors, the dance was not empty motion, but a sign, something to be understood in the light of Saint Vitus's curse, or of heaven's judgment. Belief shaped what was seen, and in that belief others joined her, body answering to mind answering to fear. And yet, for all the strangeness, the dance was also profoundly human. It showed the body under strain, moving beyond its limits, trembling with exhaustion, yet carrying on. It showed neighbors drawn together in awe, in dread, in compassion, some mocking at first, but many fetching water, lifting the collapsed, guiding the weary home when the fever broke. The community bore witness together, unable to stop what unfolded, yet bound in the act of watching, remembering, and later telling. The plague has lived on far beyond Strasbourg's walls. Artists painted it in vivid colors, bodies bent in unnatural movement, faces caught between ecstasy and suffering. Scholars traced its causes, arguing over humors and saints, over fungi and the rye and illnesses of the mind. Writers centuries later returned to it as symbol, as parable, as mystery. It became more than an event. It became a memory carried forward, transformed by each retelling into a reflection of the questions we continue to ask about ourselves. What does it mean when the mind compels the body to move against its will? What does it mean when fear spreads more swiftly than fire? When belief binds communities as surely as hunger? And what does it mean that in the end, the dance faded not with certainty, but with mystery, leaving behind swollen feet, broken shoes, unanswered questions, and silence? The silence is perhaps the most enduring. Strasbourg returned to its markets, to its sermons, to its river traffic and guild meetings. Yet in the memory of the city, there lingers the hush that followed the dancers' collapse, the sudden stillness after weeks of ceaseless rhythm. Relief and unease mixed in that silence, as though the stones themselves remembered what had passed. Centuries later, when we think of the dancing plague, it is this image that comes most clearly. The square emptied of sound, the air cooling after the heat of day, torches extinguished, crowds dispersed, stones still warm underfoot, slowly releasing their heat into the night air. And there, left behind, a single shoe, red leather perhaps, or scuffed brown, lying on its side at the edge of the square. The shoe waits in silence, an ordinary object made strange by what it witnessed. Around it, the city rests. The cathedral bells toll softly in the distance, marking the hour. The river flows beyond the walls, steady and untroubled. The stars above look down on Strasbourg as they did on every night of that long summer. The dancers are gone, their steps folded into history, their stories drifting into art and scholarship, their names mostly forgotten. But the square remains, empty now, its stones cooling in the hush of night, holding the memory of motion in their stillness. And in that quiet, empty square, cooling stones, abandoned shoe, the story of the dancing plague settles into rest, like the city itself, exhaling into sleep. And so, our story comes to rest. The voices of the past grow quiet. The streets of Strasbourg fall still, and the strange dance of 1518 fades into history. You have traveled through shadows and crowns, through mystery and memory, and now there's nothing more to do but rest. Let the last images soften, like candle flames dimming in a distant hall. Let your body feel heavier, your breath slower, your mind calm and untroubled. Sleep is already waiting for you, gentle, patient, ready to carry you deeper. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may your night be peaceful and your dreams light as air.